I wasn't planning to go to Candace's wedding. Honestly, I thought she'd eloped already and the whole thing would just pop up on Facebook with a set of heavily filtered photos, a half-naked beach minister, and one of those captions about finding peace in the arms of your soulmate. But instead, it came in the mail, a thick envelope, off-white with gold foil letters that spelled out her full name like a royal decree. Candace Marie Whitmore requests the honor of your presence. And beneath the fancy fonts, there it was, my name handwritten in black ink and a sticky note pressed gently to the edge of the RSVP card that read please dress appropriately, modest military attire only. I read it twice, then a third time. I sat down on my couch and stared at it like it was a trap. Modest military attire. Not respectful, not whatever honors your service, but modest. And that note, that condescending little scrawl, practically screamed know your place, soldier. And here I was, 34 years old, still catching backhanded jabs from a girl who married into our family and thought that made her royalty. The last time I saw Candace in person, I'd just returned from my final deployment, Afghanistan, leading a rescue operation that saved 37 lives. My hair was regulation short, my bearing sharp, and my patience worn thin from dealing with bureaucrats who'd never held a rifle. My brother hugged me tight at the airport, but Candace stood back with her arms crossed like I'd just tracked mud through her pristine world. She air-kissed me like someone greeting a distant relative they barely tolerated. And when my brother asked if I'd share some stories from overseas, Candace added, maybe keep it light. We don't need any war stories ruining dinner. That was 3 years ago. We'd barely exchanged pleasantries since. I put the invitation on my fridge, partly out of habit, partly because I didn't want it cluttering my counter for a week. It hung there next to a magnet that read retired colonel, handle with respect. I was fully prepared to ignore it until my brother called and said, Vivian, it would mean everything to Candace if you came. She's really put her heart into this day. Put her heart into it, as if she didn't have a wedding planner, a full Pinterest board, and my brother's credit card funding every detail. I bit my tongue and said I'd consider it, which was already more courtesy than her note deserved. The next morning, I found myself looking at flights, and by evening I'd booked a seat on the red-eye to Richmond. I told myself it was for my brother, that he deserved to have his family there without drama. But if I'm honest, and I try to be honest, I think I went because of that damn note. That condescension. That assumption that I'd just quietly fade into the background like some embarrassing relative. And maybe, deep down, I wanted to remind everyone exactly who they were dealing with. The day I landed, I walked into my brother's house and it smelled the same, like expensive candles, fresh flowers, and the faint tension of money spent on appearances. My brother hugged me tight and stepped back with genuine warmth in his eyes. He whispered, "You look amazing, Viv. Command suits you." "And Candace?" She glanced up from her phone and said, "Oh good, you made it. I was worried you might show up in fatigues." We were 34 and 29, but she still knew how to deliver an insult wrapped in concern. Dinner that night was like a carefully choreographed performance. My brother talked too much to fill the silences, and Candace's friends tried too hard to seem impressed by my little military career. I didn't take the bait, they didn't know. They hadn't seen me coordinate airstrikes or negotiate with foreign officials. They hadn't watched me earn the respect of generals or build a consulting firm that advised Fortune 500 companies. To them, I was just a soldier sister who'd never quite fit their country club expectations. At one point, Candace leaned over her salad and said, "By the way, white's completely off limits tomorrow. We're keeping everything traditional and pure and well." She smiled that practiced smile. The words she didn't say hung heavier than the ones she did. Someone like you wouldn't understand. The insult landed like a precision strike. Trevor looked uncomfortable, my brother studied his plate, and I just nodded. I smiled like it was reasonable, like she hadn't just questioned my character in front of everyone. I took a sip of wine and said, "Of course. Wouldn't want to upstage the bride." That night in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the version of myself they all seemed to see. The rough soldier who didn't belong in polite society. The woman who'd chosen duty over marriage, service over comfort. To them, I was always going to be the outsider, not the decorated officer who'd saved lives, not the successful consultant who advised senators and CEOs. To them, purity meant playing by their rules, staying in their boxes, never threatening their carefully constructed hierarchies. And I'd spent years letting them believe it. Around midnight, I went into Candace's old room, curious if she'd maintained the shrine to herself she'd always been so proud of. It was still pink and pristine, like a magazine spread that refused to acknowledge reality. On a high shelf in the closet, behind designer shoe boxes, I found something unexpected, a small wooden box with her initials carved into the top. Inside, a stack of old letters tied with ribbon, a wilted rose, and a small plastic bag containing a pregnancy test. Positive. And a folded paper beneath it, water-stained but still readable. Marcus, please don't contact me again. I can't handle this right now. My reputation would be ruined. I stared at it for a long time, and for once I didn't feel angry. I felt something colder, the weight of hypocrisy, the burden of secrets everyone pretends don't exist. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't the only one with a past. But the difference? I'd never hidden behind false virtue to judge others. So when she told me I couldn't wear white because someone like me wouldn't understand purity, she had no idea how perfectly that described her own situation. And that's when I decided, if she wanted traditional, I'd give her something she'd never forget. The morning sun had barely filtered through the thin curtains when I woke up in that guest room that somehow still smelled of dust and lavender, like time had stopped inside those four walls. My back ached from the too soft mattress and my jaw was sore from clenching it in my sleep. I rolled onto my side, eyes landing on the wooden box I had found the night before, Candace's box of secrets, tucked away like evidence under oath. I hadn't opened it again since the night before, but it sat on the dresser demanding attention. I knew one thing, my sister-in-law's perfect ride fantasy wasn't as flawless as she wanted everyone to believe. And maybe that meant I wasn't the only one with a complicated past after all. I took a long shower, letting the water burn just enough to wake me fully. While I stood there under the spray, I kept thinking about that name, Marcus. It had been scrawled in sharp, messy handwriting, the kind that looked rushed or scared. I vaguely remembered him. He'd been Candace's college boyfriend back when she went through her artsy phase, the same time she wore combat boots with dresses and pretended to like indie music. I hadn't thought about him in years, and even then I only heard his name whispered during family dinners when my brother would ask if that law student had finally passed the bar. After dressing and dodging the awkwardness of breakfast, where my brother tried to push small talk on me like it was some kind of peace offering, I grabbed my phone and did a quick search for Marcus. His last name was unique enough to narrow it down, and within minutes I had found him. His profile was private, but his profile picture gave away enough. Same intelligent eyes, same serious expression, but now he wore a military uniform with JAG insignia and looked like a man who'd found his calling. I stared at the photo before hitting message. I didn't overthink it. I simply typed, "Hey, this is Vivian, Candace's sister-in-law. I found something I think you should know about. Can we talk?" I sent it and tossed the phone onto the bed, half hoping he wouldn't reply, half hoping he would. He didn't reply immediately. So I went downstairs, made black coffee, and sat on the porch while Candace flitted around inside like a deranged butterfly, checking arrangements, texting vendors, and snapping at my brother about the playlist not being classy enough. She came outside at one point, holding a clipboard like she was commanding a military operation. She looked at me over her sunglasses and said, "Just a reminder, no white at the rehearsal dinner either. The photographers will be there, and I want everything coordinated." I took a slow sip of my coffee, held her gaze, and said, "I'll wear something appropriate. Wouldn't want to pollute your perfect day." She blinked, unsure if I was being sarcastic, then gave that fake laugh she used when she felt threatened. "You're so funny," she said, then turned and walked back inside like she had a tiara to adjust. I hated how easily she dismissed things, how she brushed everything off like nothing ever stuck to her, like she'd never bled or begged or made mistakes. But I had the proof now, didn't I? That box upstairs was like ammunition, and I was the only one who knew how to use it. Around 2 p.m., Marcus finally replied. His message was short. "What did you find?" I told him the truth about the test, the letter, the fact that she had hidden a pregnancy during their relationship. I offered to meet that evening, away from the house, just to talk. He agreed, and we picked a quiet diner on the edge of town, the kind where the coffee is bad but the booths offer privacy. When I walked in, he was already there, looking older but still recognizable. He stood when he saw me, unsure whether to smile. I sat across from him, And for a minute we just stared at each other like strangers searching for shared history. Finally, I slid the photos I'd taken of the note and test across the table. He stared at them for a long time, then leaned back, running a hand through his hair like he was processing 20 years of confusion. "She never told me," he said quietly. "She just disappeared. I thought maybe I had done something wrong." His voice cracked, and he looked up with eyes that weren't angry but stunned. "Why are you showing me this now?" I didn't have an answer that didn't sound petty, but I told him the truth, because she told me I wasn't pure enough to wear white, and I thought maybe someone should remind her she's not exactly the Virgin Mary. Marcus let out a soft laugh, not humor, but disbelief. She always did love playing innocent. We sat in silence for a bit. I told him I wasn't looking to destroy her life, I wasn't that cruel. But I also wasn't going to let her humiliate me in front of 100 guests with a smile on her face and poison on her tongue. He said he understood. Before we left, he asked one final question: "Why did you really come back?" I paused. Because she expected me not to. Because they all did. I went back to the house that night calmer than I'd felt in years. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with the information I had, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to disappear into the background like I always had. And if Candace wanted a perfect wedding, she was going to have to do it standing next to the truth, even if it stood silently in dress blues at the edge of the crowd. Sometimes silence says everything. The morning of the wedding began with a headache, not the kind that throbs behind your temples like a hangover, but the kind that starts deep behind your eyes and spreads outward like a pressure system. I had barely slept the night before, kept awake by the weight of everything I knew and everything I was planning to do with it. The house was already bustling with hairstylists and makeup artists by the time I came downstairs, each of them tiptoeing around Candace like she was made of glass and rage, laughing too hard at her jokes and nodding with the kind of terrified energy usually reserved for hostage situations. The smell of hairspray, perfume, and freshly baked catering trays filled the air, making it difficult to breathe without tasting the artificial sweetness of someone else's fantasy. Candace didn't look at me right away when I entered the room, probably assuming I'd taken the hint and quietly disappeared sometime during the night. But when I stepped into the kitchen to grab coffee in my old army t-shirt and sweatpants, her head snapped up with that deer-in-headlights expression she always wore when I appeared where she didn't want me. Her mouth twitched slightly, half smile, half sneer, and she said, "Oh good, you're still here. I thought maybe you'd left without saying anything." I smiled and replied, "Tempting, but I figured if I was going to make an impression, I should do it properly." It was the kind of comment that made everyone else in the room stop laughing immediately, unsure whose side they were supposed to take. Candace rolled her eyes and turned back to her curling iron, but I caught the way her hand trembled slightly, just for a second. Almost imperceptible, but it was there. I spent the morning in the background, watching her float from room to room like a queen overseeing her coronation. Everyone complimented her, everyone adored her, and no one questioned her, not even my brother, who hovered near her like a satellite desperate to stay in orbit. Meanwhile, I was just a decorative inconvenience, a seat filler with too much history and not enough tact to be paraded around like a show pony. I was the uncomfortable truth wrapped in dress blues and emotional steel, and they were all hoping I'd stay silent, nod politely, and fade into the wallpaper. Around noon, Candace pulled me aside into the hallway, her makeup half done and her voice low but sharp. "Listen, I'm going to say this once, don't make this about you. Don't wear white, don't give speeches, don't even breathe too loudly. Today is not the day to remind people you exist, Vivian." I nodded calmly, pretending to agree, pretending to submit like I always had when she'd whisper condescending comments just loud enough for me to hear. She smiled, satisfied that she delivered her warning, and turned back toward her room with the confidence of someone who truly believed she'd won something. But she had no idea that the night before, I had already picked out exactly what I'd be wearing. And it definitely wasn't beige. After she disappeared down the hallway, I went back up to the guest room and quietly opened the garment bag I'd hidden in the back of the closet behind an old storage trunk. Inside was my full military dress uniform, freshly cleaned and pressed, with every medal and pin exactly where it should be. The blues were deep and sharp, the shoes polished to a mirror shine, and the brass buttons caught the light like small, deliberate spotlights. I ran my fingers over the stitching, over the ribbons that represented things no one in this house had ever asked me about, and I took a deep breath before beginning to change. As I got dressed, I thought about the absurdity of what this day was supposed to mean. Candace, the pure bride, walking down the aisle in a dress the color of perfection, pretending she had never once bled or sinned or lied. The white fabric was a costume, a symbol for a life she had never really lived but desperately wanted everyone to believe in. Meanwhile, I was the one who had sacrificed, who had served, who had seen people die and lived through my own kind of war. And yet I was the one told to hide because I wasn't fit for her fantasy. I pinned my medals with precision: Bronze Star, Army Commendation Medal with Valor, Purple Heart, each one placed carefully, a piece of a life that had been forged in fire and grit, not in floral arrangements and cake tastings. When I stepped back and looked at myself in the mirror, I didn't see a rebel or a troublemaker. I saw a colonel, a decorated veteran, someone who had earned the right to stand wherever she pleased. Around noon, just as the final preparations were being made, Candace cornered me in the hallway outside the bridal suite. Her makeup was perfect, her hair was done, and she was already in her wedding dress, a vision of white perfection that seemed to glow under the hallway lights. But her eyes were cold, calculating, as she stepped closer to me. "Listen carefully, Vivian," she said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I'm only going to say this once." She glanced around to make sure no one else could hear, then looked back at me with pure disdain. Her face twisted with disgust as she spat out the words, "If someone like you wore white to my wedding, you'd dirty up the whole ceremony. You're not pure, Vivian, you never have been." The venom in her voice was unmistakable, each word thrown at me like a weapon designed to cut deep. I felt something cold settle in my chest, but I kept my voice level. "I understand." "Good," she said, smoothing down her dress with satisfaction. "I'm glad we finally understand each other." I walked calmly to the guest bathroom and locked the door behind me. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at myself in the mirror. Then I reached for my phone and sent a quick text to 3 contacts, military colleagues who I knew would be at the ceremony as Trevor's business associates. Colonel Vivian Hayes requesting immediate recognition protocol upon entry. Full dress blues. Please acknowledge rank appropriately. The responses came back immediately. "Roger that, Colonel." "Understood, ma'am." "Will comply, Colonel Hayes." I changed out of my civilian clothes and into my full military dress uniform. Every medal, every ribbon, every insignia placed with precision. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Army Commendation Medal with Valor. Combat Action Badge. The dark navy fabric was pristine, the brass buttons gleamed, and when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see someone who needed to hide in the back of the room. I saw a decorated colonel who had earned every inch of respect she was about to command. I walked into the ceremony hall just as the processional music began. The reaction was immediate and exactly what I had anticipated. Colonel Martinez, who I'd served with in Afghanistan, saw me first. He immediately stood at attention and saluted. Within seconds, Major Thompson followed suit. Then Captain Rodriguez. One by one, every military officer in the room, and there were 7 of them, all successful businessmen who also happened to be veterans, rose to their feet in perfect unison and saluted. The civilian guests turned to see what was happening, their mouths falling open as they witnessed something they'd never seen before, a formal military recognition ceremony happening in the middle of a wedding. "Colonel Hayes," Colonel Martinez announced in his command voice, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Thank you for your service, ma'am." The room fell into stunned silence. Every eye was on me as I returned the salute with crisp precision, my posture straight, my bearing unmistakably that of a commanding officer. And then I looked directly at Candace. Her face had gone completely white, whiter than her wedding dress. Her bouquet trembled in her hands as she stared at me in absolute shock, finally understanding exactly who she had tried to humiliate. The woman she had called impure. The woman she said would dirty up her ceremony. Was a decorated war hero. A colonel. Someone who commanded more respect in this room than she would ever possess. I walked calmly to my seat in the front row, the seat reserved for family, and sat down as the military officers slowly returned to their seats. The ceremony continued, but everyone knew something fundamental had just shifted. Candace's perfect day had just become mine. I left the room just as the guests were arriving, the murmur of small talk and clinking glasses drifting through the house like static. The ceremony was set to begin in less than an hour, and Candace was hidden away in a side room with her bridesmaids, laughing too loudly at something that probably wasn't funny. I slipped into the main hall quietly, taking my place at the back so no one could say I had tried to steal the spotlight. But when I entered, the reaction was immediate. The room fell silent. One by one, heads turned toward me, eyes widening as they took in the dark navy uniform, the sharp lines, the metals glinting against my chest. The photographer, clearly confused, lowered his camera slightly, unsure if this was a moment he was supposed to capture or pretend hadn't happened. Trevor's family stared like they'd just seen a ghost or a scandal walking upright, and my brother, who had spent most of my adult life downplaying my career in polite company, looked down at his shoes like they'd suddenly become the most interesting thing in the world. I walked slowly down the side aisle, not toward the front, but toward an empty chair near the middle, making eye contact with no one and everyone at the same time. I could feel the heat of their judgment, their confusion, their discomfort. It washed over me like a familiar kind of weather, cold, heavy, and utterly survivable. I sat down, crossed my legs, and folded my hands in my lap. No apologies, no explanations, just presence. And for the first time in years, I felt exactly where I was meant to be. From behind the door at the front of the chapel, Candace's laughter floated through again, still oblivious, still perfect. But not for long. The first few moments after I sat down in that stiff white folding chair were soaked in a silence so loud it practically echoed, the kind that makes even the shallowest breath feel like an interruption. It was the kind of stillness that only happens when someone shows up dressed for a different kind of ceremony, one not built on roses and rings, but on rules and rank. I could feel the eyes on me before I even looked up. Some narrowed with confusion, others widened with alarm, but most settled somewhere between disapproval and disbelief, like my presence had turned their little fairy tale into a military tribunal without warning. The organist, seated just beside the flower-laced altar, stopped playing mid-chord, fingers frozen in the air like she'd been struck with temporary paralysis. No one said a word, no one needed to. The air itself had thickened, clogged with a kind of tension that feels like it might snap if someone so much as coughs. I didn't smile, didn't flinch, didn't give them anything to hang on to. I simply adjusted my metals because one of them had shifted slightly when I sat down, and looked straight ahead as though I belonged there more than any of them. Because deep down, I knew I did. I had walked into a place where my existence was considered a disruption, and I had done it on purpose, not to ruin a wedding, not to start a fight, but to finally stop apologizing for who I was and what I had survived. There's a strange kind of peace in knowing the worst thing they can think about you is already something they've believed for years. You stop fearing judgment once you've been misjudged enough times. The door at the front of the chapel creaked open, and Candace stepped out in full bridal regalia. Her white dress practically glowed under the flood of sunlight from the stained glass windows. She was smiling wide, serene, confident as she linked arms with my brother and began the slow, traditional walk down the aisle. Her bouquet was a perfect ball of pale roses, her veil fell like mist over her shoulders, and every inch of her presentation screamed purity, elegance, control. But what struck me most wasn't her appearance, it was the fact that she hadn't looked left or right. She was too rehearsed, too focused on the fantasy she'd spent months choreographing to notice the fracture sitting 10 rows deep in her performance. It wasn't until she was halfway down the aisle that she saw me. It happened in slow motion, the way her eyes flickered toward my row, the way her chin tilted ever so slightly as if her brain couldn't quite register what it was seeing. Her smile faltered, a tiny slip of composure that most people would miss, but I caught it. Her steps didn't stop, her body didn't turn, but her expression shifted just enough to crack the porcelain mask she wore. I held her gaze, steady and unapologetic, and for that brief instant it was just the two of us again, sisters-in-law locked in an old, bitter silence that had followed us from the day she married into our family like a second shadow. When she reached the altar, the officiant began his opening lines, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to recover the room's rhythm. Candace looked forward again, chin high, but her shoulders were tighter now, her grip on the bouquet a little too firm. I wondered how much she had guessed already, whether she thought this was some twisted form of protest, or whether she understood that I wasn't here to disrupt her vows but to survive them with my dignity intact. The ceremony went on, every word of it sounding like it had been plucked from a greeting card. Promises about forever, declarations of love, acknowledgments of fate. Candace and Trevor repeated each line with perfect cadence, each syllable laced with practiced joy. I watched without blinking, without fidgeting, and with each passing minute I felt less like an intruder and more like a mirror she couldn't escape. Every time she looked at her groom, every time she glanced at the crowd, I could see her trying not to look at me, trying not to remember the box hidden in her closet or the name scribbled on that water-stained note that I still kept in my jacket pocket like evidence waiting for the right moment. It wasn't until the reception that everything truly began to unravel. The ballroom was lit like a movie set, chandeliers glowing, champagne flowing, and waiters dressed like tuxedoed ghosts drifting silently between tables. The music was loud, the laughter louder, and the bride was back in control, making her rounds with that calculated grace she had perfected over the years. I stayed near the back of the room, not hiding, but not exactly mingling either. Every now and then someone would approach me, usually someone from Trevor's side, asking polite questions about my service, feigning interest like they were trying to figure out if I was part of some elaborate surprise. Then the toast began. The best man told a story about Trevor's first date with Candace, how he had spilled wine on his shirt and tried to pretend it was intentional. There was laughter, warm and easy, the kind that made people lean in and smile like they were part of something permanent. The maid of honor followed, talking about how Candace had always known what she wanted, how she had been planning her wedding since middle school. More laughter, more clinking glasses. And then, suddenly, unexpectedly, Candace stood and called out my name. "Vivian," she said, her voice sweet and wide-eyed, like the trap it was, "don't you have a toast for us? After all, you made such a memorable entrance." A few people chuckled. Most turned their heads toward me, eager for another surprise, another twist in the story. I stood slowly, every inch of me screaming to sit back down, to stay quiet, to avoid becoming the villain in a room where I'd never been allowed to be the hero. But I didn't sit. I didn't stay quiet. I picked up my glass of water, no champagne, no alcohol, just plain, simple water, and I walked to the microphone. I stood in front of a crowd that wasn't mine, beside a woman who had always written me out of her script, and I spoke in the calmest voice I could manage. To Candace and Trevor, I began, letting the words hang in the air just long enough to make people lean forward. May your marriage be built on honesty, on forgiveness, and on the ability to look at each other even when the truth is inconvenient. I paused. Because purity isn't a color. It's not a dress. It's not a lie we wear because it photographs well. I looked directly at Candace. It's the courage to live with the things we've done and still choose to love ourselves anyway. There was no applause. There was no gasp. Just silence, thick and undeniable, stretching across the room like a curtain about to fall. And then, as if the universe itself had a flair for timing, the doors to the ballroom creaked open, and Marcus walked in. He wasn't supposed to be there, we had agreed on that. But maybe he needed his own kind of closure. Maybe he needed to see the fantasy for what it really was. Candace turned white, paler than the dress she wore. Trevor stood slowly, confusion scribbled across his face like a riddle he couldn't solve. And me? I stepped away from the microphone, handed off my glass, and walked back to my seat with my head held high. This was no longer about a wedding. This was about what happens when the truth finally walks into the room and refuses to leave. The sound that followed Marcus's entrance wasn't immediate chaos, nor was it the kind of loud, cinematic explosion of gasps and clattering glasses you'd expect from a moment this pregnant with tension. It was far more unsettling than that. What filled the room was an eerie, echoing quiet that only deepened as people turned their heads one by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion, each guest's gaze drawn toward the doorway where he stood, awkward and clearly unsure if he should take another step forward or just disappear. He looked older than I remembered him from the night before, like the weight of knowing had settled hard across his shoulders overnight, dragging down not only his posture but the expression on his face, which hovered somewhere between disbelief and regret. Candace, standing frozen in the center of the ballroom beneath an extravagant chandelier, stared at him with wide eyes that blinked too slowly, her knuckles whitening around her bouquet as if she could will this man and everything he represented back into the past just by gripping something tightly enough. Trevor, poor, clueless Trevor, turned toward his bride with a frown that didn't yet contain anger, only confusion, the kind that cuts in with a creeping chill rather than a slap. He looked from Marcus to Candace, back and forth, like he was waiting for someone to say this was all just a strange coincidence or a forgotten college friend stopping by with a bottle of champagne and no sense of timing. But no one said anything, and in that breathless, stretching silence, something else filled the space, understanding. Quiet and brutal, settling on the shoulders of those who noticed too much and said too little. The music had stopped. The laughter had evaporated. And all that remained was the kind of hush reserved for hospital waiting rooms and courtroom verdicts. Candace, to her credit, didn't collapse or cry or flee the room in dramatic fashion. Instead, she turned slowly, placed her bouquet down on the nearest table with a kind of precision that bordered on surgical, and walked deliberately, almost calmly, toward Marcus. For a moment, I wondered if she was going to hug him, to somehow spin this into a spontaneous reconnection with an old friend that meant absolutely nothing at all. But when she reached him, she simply looked up into his face with an expression that was almost blank, as if she were waiting for him to deliver her fate instead of fighting for it herself. "What are you doing here?" she asked, and her voice wasn't angry or afraid, it was flat, so devoid of emotion that it somehow made the room colder. Marcus didn't answer right away. He glanced toward me, and I didn't move. I wasn't going to save her, not from this, not anymore. I had done enough protecting in my lifetime. Protected my brother from uncomfortable truths, protected my family from the reality of their favoritism, protected my sister-in-law from ever having to confront the consequences of the lies she spun like silk. Not today. "I thought you'd want to know I got the message," he finally said, his voice soft enough that only the people nearest him could hear, but the ripple of tension it caused spread fast. "And I thought maybe he deserved to know too." He looked at Trevor as he said it, and I saw the color drain from the groom's face like a sunset reversed. Trevor turned to Candace with a question in his eyes, but she spoke before he could ask it. "He doesn't mean anything," she said quickly, too quickly, her voice cracking just at the edges. "This is some mistake. He's not supposed to be here. He's just an ex from college, someone I dated for a few months before I met you." Marcus didn't correct her. He didn't need to. The weight of omission was heavier than any accusation could have been. Candace's voice rose a little higher, that familiar pitch she used when she felt her control slipping. "Vivian invited him, obviously," she said, turning toward me with a glare that could have cut through steel if it weren't so thinly veiled in desperation. "She's been trying to ruin this from the beginning." I stood then, slowly, calmly, and walked toward her, not to gloat, not to yell, but to finish what I started. When I stopped just a few feet away, I looked at her not with hatred, not with vengeance, but with something colder, the quiet certainty of someone who has finally given up expecting honesty from a habitual liar. I pulled the folded note from my pocket, the one with her handwriting, the one she thought was gone, and placed it on the nearest table without a word. Marcus glanced at it but didn't touch it. Trevor didn't even look away from Candace. "No speeches," I said finally, my voice low and even. "That's what you asked for, right?" I took a step back, turned away from the room, and walked toward the doors. As I moved, the music slowly began again, some nervous DJ trying to patch over the tear in the night with a gentle instrumental, the audio equivalent of sweeping glass under the rug. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected. I stood for a while in the gravel lot, watching the wind toss bits of confetti across the asphalt like failed celebrations. I wasn't angry. I wasn't proud. I was simply done. Done with the role they'd written for me, done with being the problem child, the difficult sister-in-law, the scapegoat who soaked up the shame so everyone else could shine a little brighter. Let them figure out who they were without me propping up the lie. Marcus came out a few minutes later, walking slowly with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets like he wasn't sure if he should say something or just keep going. When he reached me, he stopped, looked at the car I was standing beside, and then back at me. "You didn't have to do it like that," he said, not accusing, not judging, just observing. I nodded. "No, but if I hadn't, she never would have stopped." He tilted his head slightly. "Do you think you won?" I looked back at the glowing hall behind us, where the party continued like a machine grinding forward despite missing parts. "I don't think there was anything to win," I said finally. "But I didn't lose. That's enough." He opened his mouth to respond, then thought better of it. And after a quiet moment of shared understanding, he turned and walked away. I watched him go, then climbed into my rental car. The uniform was stiff against the seat, but somehow more comfortable than anything else I had worn in that house in years. I sat there for a moment, letting the engine idle, watching the silhouettes of people behind the curtained windows continue to drink and dance and pretend. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just pulled out of the lot slowly, leaving behind the music, the flowers, the chandeliers, and the ruins of someone else's white lie. And as I drove down that familiar road, past the oak trees and weather-worn fences of the neighborhood where I'd spent my entire life being half seen, half heard, I realized something strange. For the first time in years, I wasn't running away from them. I was simply going somewhere else. Somewhere I chose. Somewhere honest. Whatever came next, it would be mine. And that, for once, felt like a kind of freedom they could never take. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please consider subscribing and pressing the like button.